first glance, it's hard to imagine that such a seemingly harmless scene as this has stirred such a storm of controversy.
Well, a lot of people in this community are opposed to it.
There is a lot of misinformation and just plain lack of information about what aquaculture really is.
The benefit is not going to be for the poor little guy here, so to speak, that's struggling to make a living already.
We feel that we can protect the environment, protect the water quality.
We're never going to have a situation where all of the questions are answered.
We just think there are far too many unknowns to be able to feel with any confidence that the wild stocks that Alaska depends on so thoroughly for its economic base are not going to be in any danger.
As edibility goes, I'd say that I don't think there's anything that compares to wild salmon. As far as feeding the world goes, I think aquaculture is what's happening.
These are salmon farms, and obviously there is more to them than first meets the eye. Since 1980, the salmon farming industry has been growing at an explosive pace around the world. Now policymakers in Alaska are trying to resolve the question of whether to farm or not to farm. Salmon farming is the raising of juvenile salmon to maturity in net pens. Unlike Alaska salmon hatcheries, where the juvenile fish are released and allowed to grow on their own in the open seas, the salmon farm fills its pens with smolt and keeps them there for their entire life. A typical salmon farm is made up of enclosed pens built by hanging nets from square floating frames. The pens are anchored in nearshore marine waters. The seed for these farms is young salmon, called smolt. They are raised in hatcheries, and by the time they are transferred to the farm, the smolt are between 6 and 18 months old. The smolt cost about 50 cents each. On the farm, feeding is done either by automation or by hand. The food is made of binders, vitamins, and antibiotics, added to fish processing waste and formed into bite-sized pellets. It takes about 2 years for the fish to reach marketable size, and about half of the farmer's costs are in feed. On the average, farmers expect to lose 20 to 30% of their fish to disease or predators before they can be harvested. However, this can sometimes be much higher during troublesome algae blooms or when fish escape from seal-torn or storm-damaged nets. The farmer harvests his crop when the fish are big enough and when he has a market order for fresh product. This usually occurs during the winter to minimize competition with wild salmon runs in the summer. Harvesting is done simply by drawing up the net in a pen and pumping the fish into a tender tanked with oxygenated seawater. The oxygen keeps the fish alive for the short trip to the processing plant. Sometimes larger tenders with more elaborate systems are used. When live fish reach the processing plant, which in this case is owned cooperatively by several nearby farmers, they are pumped into totes. CO2 is bubbled into the water to anesthetize the fish. All this is done to minimize rough handling of excited fish. Bruising of the flesh is reduced by cutting the artery of the stunned fish and placing it in a chilled bleeding tank for approximately 20 minutes. The bled and chilled fish are then quickly gilled and gutted, washed and iced for shipment to market.
Usually within 24 hours it can be in San Francisco or Boston.
The principal markets for farm salmon are Europe, the United States, and Canada. 60% of the fish go to restaurants.
Fresh salmon, fresh crab today, folks. Step right up here.
While 40% go to supermarkets and fish markets. The farmer is paid anywhere from $3 to $5 per pound for the product. The farmer's profit is between 50 cents to $2.50 a pound. An average farm then producing about 600,000 pounds of salmon a year would reap a profit between $300,000 and $1.5 million a year. Salmon farms are located worldwide. In the early 1970s, Norway became the pioneer of this industry's development. Today, farms are found in 12 other countries. Norway's estimated 600 farms produce well over half the annual world supply of farmed salmon. They are expected to supply over 200 million pounds in 1990. Norway is also a major exporter of farm technology, equipment, and management personnel to other farming countries. British Columbia has experienced a rapid expansion in the industry since 1983. The 150 farms along the BC coast are expected to produce 50 million pounds of salmon in 1990. In the United States, there are now a dozen or so salmon farms operating in the state of Washington, and also a few in Maine. In Alaska, the issue of whether or not to allow salmon farms is under debate. Clearly, there can be many positive economic benefits of the industry.
Oh, it's definitely put a lot of money back into the economy. This whole coastline at one time was made up of fishermen, and loggers. And now, of course, we have the processing industries, the farms. It's brought a lot of employment to the Sunshine Coast.
It's unbelievable, really. 4 years ago now, the Sunshine Coast area was in a real economic down, and now there are plenty of jobs around.
Alaska proponents say that a 20,000-ton-a-year salmon farming industry would give our state 1,900 direct jobs with a payroll of $48 million and about the same number of indirect jobs in the supply and service industries. That it would create about $130 million in gross sales, and that it would utilize over 100,000 tons of raw fish processing waste as feed. However, opponents say there are several issues that need to be examined and resolved before lawmakers make any decisions. These can be divided into the environmental issues, the economic issues, and the social issues. The environmental issues are water quality, the seabed, introduction of exotic species, antibiotics and hormones, disease, genetic alteration, and predator conflicts.
The two primary water quality impacts of concern would be depletion of dissolved oxygen by both respiration of the fish and decomposition of that feed and feces. As it decomposes, it strips oxygen from the water. And the other effect, in addition to depletion of oxygen, would be increase in nitrogen compounds. Most notably, ammonia is the principal nitrogen compound that comes from net pens. The nitrogen can stimulate phytoplankton growth. Excessive phytoplankton growth gives you what is commonly called a bloom. They're natural occurrences in Puget Sound and elsewhere throughout the world, but the farmer would do well to avoid sites where the nitrogen he adds through farming would increase the frequency or severity of these blooms, not only from the standpoint of environmental protection, but because a lot of those plankton, which could bloom, will have adverse effects on the fish themselves, causing mortalities, disease, whatever.
Another closely related issue is the seabed. Unutilized feed and the feces also have an effect on the sediment under the pen and in a small area around the pen.
When I first got involved in this, I protested to the government, and they sent two people from the Ministry of Lands and Forests here to their representatives. And I asked them, I said, what about the excrement from the farm? And they told me, well, don't worry about it, Mr. Richardson. Fish excrement all drops straight down. And I said, well, then what happens when it builds up to 2 or 3 feet under the pen? They said, well, don't worry about that, Mr. Richardson. There's excellent flushing action here. In other words, it'll flush. And I said, well, where does it flush to? And they just gave me a blank look. So in other words, this tons and tons of excrement is being flushed all over the place here. And sooner or later, that's got to stink, and sooner or later, that's got to pollute the place.
And you may cause blooms of things you don't want to bloom. In the worst cases, you know, it could result in a red tide here and there. The buildup of material on the bottom is dependent on the site, of course, but the one that we saw this morning at Domsey was probably 3 to 4 inches thick with sulfur bacteria right underneath the pens. And this is a jeopardy to the net pen itself. Also, if you devise a means of clearing that stuff out, you know, if you, the Norwegians take a fan to it and blow it out, and short term that solves the problem because it doesn't poison the fish above it. But long term, you spread that over a considerable distance, and over how many years, you know, I don't know what the impact will be. I don't think anyone does.
For most pens which have been cited to date, they're in perhaps 60 feet of water or less. And under those conditions, almost without exception, we've seen accumulation of feed and feces on the bottom and consequent chemical and biological effects to the sediment. Those effects may include most notably a decrease in the number of species of organisms living in the sediment. That would be worms, clams, small crustaceans, those animals that are below the sediment water boundary. Those types of organisms generally have a decreased number of species in the vicinity of a net pen, or for that matter, a mussel raft, or any other source of organic input, whether it's a sewage treatment plant, pulp mill, seafood processor. You generally see the same type of effect, a decrease in species, often though an increase in numbers of individuals. Those few species that are able to tolerate those conditions do extremely well.
Yeah, I think there is going to be some impact. I don't think how there isn't going to be some. That you have to make sure your farm is planted the right spot, I think. We have fairly deep water, it goes out to about 400 feet here, and we have a really good flushing action here as well. So we aren't as concerned as maybe if we're in a very protected bay with shallower water, then obviously you have to keep even more care of it.
I think it's really pretty well established now that the environmental impacts of salmon farming in locations which are properly chosen, where the salmon farms are well managed, are negligible. And there are good siting criteria now, criteria in terms of depth, in terms of current speed, where it's pretty well established that there won't be serious environmental impacts if the farm is then well managed.
If you foul your own nest as a salmon farmer by putting too many fish in too small a space in a constricted waterway where there isn't sufficient flushing and therefore where there isn't sufficient dilution of the organic matter that's going into the water, then you're going to be the first one to suffer for it. So in that sense, it's self-policing.
Generally, experts say to minimize the organic enrichment problem, a farm should be sited over deep water with good, strong water flow and a mile or so separation between sites. The best scientific evidence says that pens will affect both water quality and the seabed, but that those effects will be very localized.
Salmon farming requires the availability of exceptionally good sites. Without good sites, you may as well forget getting involved in salmon farming.
Bringing non-native species such as Atlantic salmon into Alaska is of great concern because of the risk of spreading exotic diseases and parasites. In addition, there is a risk that the Atlantic salmon escapees might successfully establish themselves in our streams and compete for food and spawning habitat with the native Pacific salmon.
The species of fish here, salmon and trout, have evolved to these geographic areas and are best adapted for them, and we're concerned about any potential impact on that unique gene pool.
We have pretty strong regulations against bringing new species into the state, and I would imagine they would continue, or might continue, in a salmon farming environment as well.
Farmers use food additives for various purposes. Certain antibiotics may be added to combat disease, and hormones to manipulate the sex of salmon used for broodstock. There is concern that these antibiotic substances may find their way into the food chain and lead to the development of new strains of antibiotic-resistant bacteria.
So you're in the position of having a feedlot with all of the problems that implies, and all of the overcrowding, and all of the disease, and all of the necessity for drugs and medications and fungicides of unknown effects, right smack dab in an estuary that is producing your wild stocks, not only of salmon, but of halibut, of black cod, of shrimp. All kind of creatures pass through estuaries at some point in their life cycle, and it's often during the time when they're most vulnerable, when they're extremely small.
The effect of these drugs is unknown at present, but scientists speculate that because they are relatively short-lived, dissolve, and are diluted quickly, their effects are probably minimal. Disease and genetics, they appear to be the two environmental issues of most concern. If penfish are stressed, they can be susceptible to disease. Overcrowding, undernourishment, poor water quality, and physical damage can stress a penned fish. The fear is if a diseased farm fish escapes and is free to intermingle with wild fish, it will spread its disease to them.
And if you're going to have a viable thing, you need to market a lot of them, and there'll be a tendency to overcrowd like they did in Norway, and that brings disease on overcrowding.
Even with the best technology, when you're putting pens out here in this environment with the kind of weather we have, you're going to have things break apart. You're going to have some of the fish escape. And the real concern is that whatever diseases they have, whatever genetic changes they may develop over the years, as those fish go and breed and mingle with the wild stocks, you may create some problems, both in terms of disease and long-term genetic changes.
It's my opinion that we are capable of dealing with them and in a properly regulated environment can make them acceptable risks.
I mean, the disease issue is kind of a boogeyman issue. It's one that, you know, you can't say there is no such thing as disease in salmon or any problem with disease in salmon, because there is. The facts, as I know them, though, are that all the diseases that occur in farmed salmon are from wild fish. They all stem from the diseases that these fish have had with them for, I don't know, hundreds of thousands, millions of years in the wild.
The Fred Division, the state, the private nonprofits really don't have much experience in raising a fish from an egg to a full-grown fish.
We've learned to live with the disease on the one hand. We've learned to develop vaccines, like the vaccine for Vibrio, which is a bacteria that affects fish in salt water. And in terms of this freshwater phase of culture, it is really quite equivalent and exactly the same as what we currently do with the ocean ranching program presently. So the disease policies, the technology that has been developed over these many years in many other states in the Union and in other countries for that matter are very applicable to the salmon farming situation.
Roger said that no scientist says that there has been any disease transferred, but there is a very disturbing news report from Norway that I think it's 500 tons of fish have already died from a parasite that's been transferred from farmed fish to wild fish. Now, I don't think that many people would call a parasite a disease. I mean, that could be anything from a little worm that lives on the side of the fish to something that's actually growing inside. I haven't been able to find out just exactly what that report is about, but that's an awful lot of fish, 500 tons to be killed.
Domesticated animals are not very likely to interbreed successfully with wild animals. But even more basic than that, I think, is the experience we've had in the state with salmon hatcheries in the context of ocean ranching. I think that we know enough now about salmon genetics and about salmon pathology that we can design adequate regulatory measures to make the risks acceptable. And evidence of that is that we've already done it in the context of our salmon hatchery program in Alaska.
We have various permit systems that regulate the transfer of fish. They're designed to limit the development of any kind of a disease organism. They have been proved to be very satisfactory over time, and we would propose, if the form of salmon farming was permitted in Alaska, we would propose to essentially implement these policies, which would apply very appropriately to this form of culture also.
The hatchery system selects as carefully as they can for wild characteristics. They don't want to tame these fish. Their whole purpose is to put smolts into the ocean that will come back, that will be able to survive in the wild and come back for harvest by sport, commercial, and subsistence users. They need fish to be as wild as possible to survive. What the farmers will need are fish that are as tame as possible in order to do well in a domesticated situation.
There's that natural selection process out there. If some farm fish get out and do end up breeding with some wild stocks, and they have these characteristics that Kate was talking about, being docile and so forth, those fish won't be able to survive. Those fish will not survive in the natural selection process.
But Norwegian scientists say escapees are one of the reasons they developed a sperm bank. The other reasons were acid rain and a parasite brought in from Swedish hatcheries. The scientists believe a minimum of 13% of the salmon in southern Norway's rivers have come from local farms. The scientists say even though they do not know the extent of interbreeding yet, they do expect hybridization to occur and reduce the genetic variation of the natural stocks. They add the problem is expected to get much worse.
Occasional escapees must reach a minimum number to make an impact. But all these questions are under discussion right now, and it's such a young industry that we really do not know.
We have basically 5 species of salmon, tremendous genetic pool, and we really shouldn't tamper with that. We not only have a commitment to ourselves now to be profitable, but we also have a commitment to future generations.
Birds and marine mammals are attracted to the pens for a free meal, and some people worry that efforts to deter these predators are having a detrimental effect.
And we see that these salmon farms are going to be very attractive prey for marine mammals, as well as people and birds, but our particular concern is marine mammals.
Frustrated farmers have resorted, at times, to firecrackers or shooting to control predator problems. But there are less harmful ways of keeping the mammals away from the pens.
I think the incidences are getting more and more, I guess, as they get more accustomed to the farms and things like that. But a lot of people now are taking more precautions against it, as I said, predator nets, and just keep an eye on them a little bit.
It's a big concern. Seals and sea lions and these things can be a big problem, and of course they can make fish escape from the farms. But there is ways to go around that, and like my own farm, we have a 5-inch troll mesh around the whole farm, around like a big bag around the whole farm to prevent seals and sea lions to get into it. Which is a very big investment to do, but you know, one sea lion attack, it probably pays back 100 times. I'm not so worried about the money in that case.
Some farmers keep dogs to patrol their farm.
If you use an electric fence, for example, for otters and mink, they learn that they get shocked when they go near there and they don't come back again. And they also teach their babies not to go there too. So I've had tremendous success in keeping predators away from our salmon. We have not got a predator problem. Other people, unfortunately, think that these things can be solved by lethal means. And I think that is more a matter of education than anything else. The main point is that salmon farming is not necessarily in conflict with wildlife or with wildlife preservation. As a matter of fact, they're very complementary.
The economic issues of concern to opponents are the cost to the state, smolt supply, monopolization by big business, and the impact on wild salmon markets. Since Alaskan oil revenues have declined, any new industry is being heavily scrutinized for how much it will cost the state to administer and regulate.
Of course, our concern also is where's this money going to come from? Is it going to come out of the fish and game budget, which is really at a minimum amount now? Or is the legislature going to approve additional funds for this type of operation when, in fact, the state government is supposedly $200 million in the red this coming year? So, it's going to be very difficult decisions there to be made on whether we're going to fund mariculture or whether we're going to fund, continue to fund the Fish and Game Department at the present levels.
Well, we've got commercial fisheries that are already going with people depending on them that are suffering because there aren't adequate management funds. And we'd hate to see the state allocate monies away from where we need them in existing fisheries to potentially new salmon farming technologies.
And that's our concern. Are you going to try to take money away from our management of the salmon the wild stocks.
Proponents suggest that a simple fee such as the 1 1/4 cents a pound proposed in Washington State will more than cover the state's cost. Another issue of concern to fishermen is where the seed smolt will come from. In British Columbia, they have come from public hatcheries.
This is where the industry in BC obtained its original seed stock. There are a couple in particular of large federal hatcheries where there are surplus Chinook returning to the hatchery, so that the government was able to recover more money from the fish by selling the eggs into the private industry. So that's how we've up till now obtained our seed, and it's only in the last year or two that brood stock from the farms, domestic fish, are now being used to produce the eggs. And this year, for the first time, there were more Chinook eggs produced by the farms from their own brood stock than there were wild eggs injected into the industry. Next year, the industry will be virtually self-sufficient.
Alaskan fishermen worry that smolt would come from the existing hatcheries, thus reducing the amount of fish returning to their fisheries.
The Alaska Board of Fisheries must deal with any new allocation of eggs, fry, or adult salmon or trout, because these species are what are called fully allocated at the present time. There's a limited entry fishery here, and there are these species of fish are allocated presently, and a surplus that would be created to sell fish for farming, where the fish wouldn't contribute to the common property fishery, would require approval of the Board of Fisheries.
Another question is, will a small owner-operator be able to successfully run a farm, or will they become monopolized by large agribusiness corporations with foreign investors and managers who take the profits out of the region?
One of the things that we didn't anticipate, but is an important issue, I think, when you're looking at economic impact of salmon farming, is who will own the farms and therefore benefit from them. The majority of our investment here has been Norwegian. The Norwegians insist on vertical integration. If you're going to buy a pump, you buy a Norwegian pump. We've met electricians who have never seen these Norwegian pumps before. We produce very good pumps in Canada, but they're not allowed to put them on their farms, because if they're going to have Norwegian capital, they must use Norwegian pumps. And nets and rails and all the things that would mean secondary impact are being imported.
A number of years ago, when I was editor of a fisherman's newspaper, I generated a number of stories about control by the Japanese of the Alaska seafood industry. There was a great deal of concern. The state legislature ordered a study into the matter, and they confirmed that all this was taking place. They ended up deciding not to do anything about it. However, the benefits have been tremendous. Our markets in Japan are the mainstay of the salmon industry in Alaska.
There's also a social responsibility to each other, and I think that, again, going back to capitalizing on this resource, that you're taking something that's the people's right, the public property, away and giving it to just a few.
We've had this debate, I guess, about the use of public resources for private gain. This is one of the things that's often raised. But the forests of this country are forested for private gain. The fish of this country are caught for private gain. I see nothing inconsistent in using a few acres of seawater for a commercial activity.
Opponents reason that large corporations will probably wind up controlling the industry because startup costs for salmon farms are too high for most owner-operated or mom-and-pop businesses.
This is actually really small. Like, most of the farms actually all throughout here are basically Norwegian financed. I think there's only, well, they're either public or offshore money. I think there's only 2 of us here that really have our own farms. Like, when you're a small farm, if you're going to start like right from scratch, I guess, and buy everything brand new right off the factory, then I guess you are looking at $1 million and probably over $1 million. You know, but if you're lucky enough to find like an older barge or things like that, something that's livable and do you until you get in a cash flow position, and like that's, you know, we're just lucky there. If we didn't, you know, make a few good finds, then obviously we wouldn't be able to do it, because it would be well over $1 million. We're about a 200-ton farm here right now, and I would say our total operating budget is probably over $500,000, and then our capital costs are much less. Where you'll see a lot of the other farms, especially the Norwegian farms, are very high capital up front.
My farm, Quatsino Sea Farms, is totally a family operation. It's 100% owned by our family and has been for 4 years. We intend to keep it that way, although the temptation to seek outside financing is very great once you've established yourself, because then the tendency is to want to expand the operation once you've got it up and running. That's the way to really stay independent, and you have to be content to start small and to grow slowly and maybe to stay small in the long run.
In terms of the investment, to see a 250 metric ton farm through until you've marketed your first major crop is around a $2 million investment. Thus far we haven't invested nearly that much in this farm. But by the time we get to market, there will be that much invested.
I can only talk for myself, but the farm I got now, we have it's about close to 4 million Canadian dollars into it. And our production will be in 88 about, say, 600,000 to 800,000 pounds. So.
And how much do you get for the fish?
Twice as much as we invested.
It looks to us like it's going to take a big capital investment to make these things go at all. We think the real benefits in the near future are for the people selling the technology, selling the know-how, financing the pen developing, selling insurance to these people, selling feed as they get going, and that the benefit is not going to be for the poor little guy here, so to speak, that's struggling to make a living already.
There are ways of raising money other than venture capital from large corporations. For instance, the business can go public and raise money by selling stock, or it can seek money from banks. To obtain financing, though, a business normally has to prove it has a long history of profitable operation. Canadian banks have been leery.
In the early stages of the game, it was a highly speculative, like anything else. Nobody had done it before. It was brand new. There was no absolute assurance that Pacific salmon would grow in pens. There's still not a real established market. Over the long term, there seems to be a very good short-term market for salmon. But we have to look at this over a long scale. If you're going to invest hundreds or thousands or even millions of dollars and a payback over a number of years, you want to be sure that payback is there 10 years down the road.
CIBC has now decided salmon farming is a worthwhile investment, but they caution.
If they really want to see this business boom, it requires, if you wanted unlimited amounts of cash, it will require government support to be in there.
We've had some bad experiences with numerous loan programs during the years that we had oil money, and obviously we don't have that oil money now, and I don't visualize in any substantial support for any industry at the present time from state government.
If the state is unwilling or unable to do something like that, it's probable that the financing of aquaculture in Alaska will be done to a great extent by venture capital people who probably would be non-residents of the state and who would be looking at, because they are taking a great risk with their capital, at maximizing the profits from the successful operations if they are successful. Then, of course, those profits would be exiting the state of Alaska.
If they open the door to the aquaculture industry and banks from the United States, or maybe Canada as well, don't get involved, you're going to see all kinds of foreign investment. And I can't blame them. If we don't take the ball and run with it, then it's our loss.
Last time I looked into it, there was about 60% of the farms in BC are Norwegian investors.
Another source of initial financing could be fishermen's cooperatives.
We might be trying to be one of the alternatives to perhaps the offshore interests that would come in as a rallying point for the development of of the operation and of obtaining the capital necessary to operate the operation for the first 2 or 3 years when there is no significant income and a lot of significant outgo in the amount of money that's being handled back and forth. I think we'd be very interested in getting in that.
Well, we live in a very international world. There are many, many American companies operating overseas who remit profits back to the United States and vice versa. There are many American states who are wooing with all the effort they can muster, bring Japanese car companies and so forth here because they perceive that, on balance, the benefits brought by economic development, by local manufacture, by local jobs is worth it, even though some profits may well go overseas. In practice, many companies who invest in another country, if they're successful, will continue to reinvest, and so those profits never find their way back, they get reinvested.
Another aspect of this feared monopolization is that there could very well be a glut of farm product by 1990, causing an economic downturn in the industry. Some say that when this happens, small farms such as this one, producing less than 500 tons a year, will not have enough volume to remain profitable.
Well, both myself and my wife, we own 100% of our own company, so it's been hard. We have like a growing contract with with a big fish producer, and plus also we get our money through a Canadian bank, which has taken a lot of sweat and a few tears along the way. So until they really get confident in the industry, they're still fairly reluctant, and you'll probably hear that on most farms. And that's why a lot of farms are Norwegian based, because nobody knew enough about the industry and nobody had enough confidence in the industry. So if you start small, then it's helped us, but sometimes there's an economy of scale there. Like so far, it hasn't hurt us. Some of the bigger farms argue that only big farms will survive.
Now they may have money from a large General Motors may invest in them, but it's still that's not going to succeed because they're General Motors. It's going to succeed who is on the farm and the day-to-day management. And what we like to see is the on-the-day management also have an equity interest in there to make sure that he has a personal motivation to make sure that everything works out and is successful.
I think that there's going to be a bust. I don't think there's ever, not in this province, there's never been a boom like this without a bust. What worries us is that the consequences of a bust in salmon farming could be very, very costly for the public treasury. If a number of people find that they've miscalculated their market aspects or they've overfed their fish and can't make money, they may simply find it cheaper to walk away and leave the fish to die. And if that's the case, we may have disease outbreaks and so on from very poor animal husbandry, which the public will have to pay for, not the salmon farming industry.
What happens when a farmer forfeits on a loan?
We don't know yet. We haven't had anything go bad. We've had some a little nervous so far, but we won't know because it's too new. Historically, we can look at our beef cattle industry. We know it has its ups and downs. We can look at the grain industry. It has its ups and downs. I expect, just by matter of course, aquaculture will have its ups and downs.
Many farmers, though, remain optimistic.
The concern would be if we get complacent, if we assume the market is going to just be there for us when the fish comes along, then I'm sure we will see periods of glut and very weak prices. But the market's there. The seafood market in general in the United States is enormous and wanting more fish. It's generally recognized to be supply limited. Here's another supply of fish.
I think we've got a long way to go before there's a glut. The North American market and the American market particularly is vast. The interest in seafood generally is very encouraging, and in fresh seafood in particular leads us to think that it'll be a long time before it starts to really back up.
And finally, there's no doubt that salmon farming does create jobs.
We right now employ 25 people in Port Angeles. We have another 7 at our hatchery down in Rochester, which is also in Washington. So we have 32 people employed. We're processing our fish with a local processing company, which is employing another 14 people through this winter on a part-time basis for processing our fish. And that level of economic activity just has secondary effects throughout the community. Every time one of us goes and spends something on something personal or things for the business, ones adding sort of economic activity to the community.
The jobs are nothing to write home about. A cannery job here in BC pays between $12 and $13 an hour Canadian in a unionized plant. To work on a lot of the salmon farms, to start, the wages, even if you've got some post-secondary training, may only run $6 to $9.
I mean, they say it's going to make jobs, but it's not going to be much of a job. You know, the high-paying jobs and the interesting jobs will come in from outside, and the rest of us will be standing there throwing fish food 3 times a day at a pen of fish.
The main markets for salmon caught by commercial fishermen are also the main markets for farm salmon: Japan, North America, and Europe. Salmon fishermen worry that farm fish will lower wild fish prices.
Maybe like a minor conflict, but I think we're both going for different markets anyways. You know, we're selling a farm fish, we're selling a wild fish, and there's people that wild fish is wild fish and farm fish is farm fish.
But the difference in BC is that the fishing is heavy, and it makes us, we can't sell our fish from our farms between late May, early June till September, because we can't compete with the price the fishermen do get for their fish.
The impact on prices, I think, that we felt in the wild fishery here has been from aquaculture fish grown in Norway and shipped into Europe rather than here. Firstly, the tonnage in British Columbia has been so small up till now that it hasn't been enough to affect the market.
So I think what's produced outside of Alaska is going to affect our markets more than what's produced inside of Alaska in terms of competition. I think where it's going to hurt us is that if we have Alaska farm salmon along with Alaska wild salmon, that the overall quality of Alaska salmon, the consumer can't be sure that it's buying a first quality Alaska wild product.
Norwegian fish now dominate the European market for fresh and frozen salmon and are heavily impacting sales in the U.S.
Well, overall, I don't think there's any question of the fact that pen-reared salmon are directly competitive with troll-caught coho and chinook and better quality net-caught salmon. In general, the competition tends to be most direct during the production season for salmon, when a lot of them are hitting the fresh market in direct competition with pen-reared fish. During the winter, a lot of Alaska and Washington salmon are sold to smokers, who are also purchasers of pen-reared Norwegian fish.
At the Pike Street Market in Seattle, Washington, fresh farmed silvers from Chile sell side by side with wild salmon.
We sell more of the farm salmon. The blackmouths, the local blackmouths, the wild ones, probably have a better name. More people ask for them, but a lot of times they will opt for the silvers because of the price, the farm silvers because of the price.
If you take the industry as a whole, though, farmed salmon clearly is competitive or is competing with salmon from Alaska. We know the French and the Germans are buying a lot of salmon from Norway right now, which in the past they would have bought as frozen salmon from Alaska. So yes, there's salmon in the market that's competing. Equally, I think it would be fair to say that the market in general for salmon over the last 2 or 3 years has definitely grown. The farmed salmon has added on to what was originally available, so there's more salmon being sold than there was. It's also true to say that the prices for farmed salmon have been consistently high over the last few years and have been as higher this year than they were last, despite increased volumes.
Yes, farm salmon is going to impact wild salmon in a certain little microcosm, but in the overall situation, I think it's what it comes down to is quality and marketing.
Proponents of salmon farming argue that farm fish could actually help the market for wild fish by keeping the consumer mind and mouth on fresh salmon during the winter off-season.
From a cooperative standpoint, it would be a great idea, because if we had members who were also aquaculture people, we could keep our plant operating with a higher volume all year long and consequently help not just our marketing programs, but our operations costs and everything else in the thing. And yes, there's competition, there's stiff competition. We don't mind the competition. We just want everybody to play on the flat field, and as long as the field is flat and we get to compete right along with them, then we're happy with the competition.
The BC Salmon Farmers Association conducted a study which demonstrated that farmed and wild salmon are not substitutes for one another and thus don't compete.
Where we brought about seven or eight of the major restaurant buyers, chefs in the lower mainland area of British Columbia together to talk about farm salmon and what their perceptions were of the product. And invariably the thing came down to is that they did not see fresh farm salmon competing with frozen sockeye. I mean, they weren't in the same camp.
But other market analysts have found wild fish, even if frozen, preferred over farmed.
The chefs will take the Alaska troll salmon. I mean, there's enough customer feedback now about flavor or lack of flavor in the farm salmon that the chefs just have a natural inclination to take the troll kings.
Right now we'd be cooking frozen as opposed to farm-raised fresh. I would prefer it. Once again, it was harvested and frozen at the time where it was still putting fat on its body. I think from an edibility standpoint, it's preferred even to fresh farm-raised salmon.
The market for fresh and frozen salmon, especially in Europe, has soared in the past few years and could even double in some countries by 1990.
The amount of fish that people are going to eat per capita is limited right now by availability.
Most seafood marketing experts say the solution to the wild versus farm market question is to join forces and push both kinds of salmon against beef and chicken. In 1987, the U.S. consumed 15 million tons of beef, 8 million tons of chicken, and only 1.5 million tons of fish. So it's difficult to say just what farmed salmon in Alaska would do to the wild salmon prices.
That fishermen, if they're concerned about longevity of their markets and their positioning on a market domestically and worldwide, is to get real serious about this quality issue. There's much that needs to be done.
As for whether market competition should even be an issue,
I wouldn't have thought so in this country, whose sort of main commercial philosophy has been about free competition.
there are a couple of social issues raised by salmon farming: aesthetic impact and conflicts with boaters. Many shoreline residents strongly object to looking out over a salmon farm from their homes. In certain areas like Washington's Puget Sound and the British Columbia coast, this is the principal opposition to the industry.
And the major conflict on the foreshore now with yachters is fish farms. And the yachters say that their answer to that problem is they won't return. And it's the same thing with residents. If I was to look for a place to build a home on the waterfront, now I certainly wouldn't pick the Sunshine Coast to build it on. I would go someplace where I had a guarantee that there wasn't going to be a fish farm placed in front of my home.
The one comment you can make about a salmon farm is that it alters the view. To some people, it shows human activity, economic activity that means jobs and employment for the young people, careers for the young people to go into. To other people who've already got theirs, they want to see everything remain the same.
I can't relate to someone who wants no sign of any industrial activity or any industry or any human industriousness. You know, I like to see something going on around me, that we do eat and we do use all these things in our lives. And I think it's elitist to want to be totally divorced and alienated from any means of production or any actual, real economic activity.
They're simply not very pleasant to look at. And the greatest development in this whole area has been for recreational and residential residences that really depend very heavily on the view and the quiet and the overall combination of visual attractiveness that make the area so great.
And of course, then we had the environmental community who is concerned about what it's going to do to the aesthetic values of certain areas in southeastern.
Washington State has decided that in order to reduce visual impact, farms should be located on sites with low shoreline banks, have existing marine activity, have no residences, and be farther than 1,500 feet from shore. be colored blue or green to blend with the water, and have a low vertical profile. Fishermen and other boaters are concerned that salmon pens will restrict access to open anchorages, favorite fishing sites, and navigable passages.
If you're a gillnetter or seiner, you're effectively being cut out of a fishing area. And you have a right to that fishing area. That's part of your business. That's part of how you make your living. The only solution I might see is if you move the operations totally ashore.
One of the things we're worried about is sighting. Because a lot of us commercial fishermen are in the fishery because we like being out and going into these places, and these are the same places that are going to be needed to site your all kinds of mariculture projects. And we're worried that some of these best sites will be preempted and will no longer be available to us to anchor for safety reasons, for recreation reasons, or just for convenience reasons to the commercial grounds.
Well, you know, there's no doubt about it that there are legitimate user group conflict issues that need to be resolved when it comes to new development going in where there was none before. In that sense, our position as the BC Salmon Farmers Association has been to recognize that there are areas in which there are higher uses than aquaculture. There are also areas where where two or three uses can coexist.
We're concerned about the biological effects on the habitat and our natural resources. We're concerned about the conflict between users, and we're concerned about where the money's coming from.
I think to open it up without adequate funds for regulation, without adequate funds already done in research and development to see how these things are going, would be a tragedy not only for myself and other fishermen, salmon fishermen, but would be a real mistake for the state as a whole. And I think what's in the best interest of the state of Alaska is to go real carefully on this and to make sure that it's number one natural resource industry in this state, renewable resource, which is salmon fishing, remains the highest priority in terms of resource allocation, resource protection, and resource funding.
The state of Alaska has said that if salmon farming is allowed, it must benefit Alaskans and not compete with commercial fisheries, pay for itself, be developed in an orderly fashion, comply with health and sanitation regulations, protect the biological integrity of natural stocks, protect the environment, be sited to minimize user conflicts, provide strictly regulated smolt acquisition. So what should Alaska do?
Well, my recommendation would be to Alaska would be that not to allow fish farms. I see them as destroying this area for tourism. I see them as a real threat to the jobs of the commercial fishermen. I see them as a devaluing of people's property when they put them into residential areas. There's no doubt about it that I've lost a considerable amount of money off the value of my property if I could sell it at all.
I think we've got too much at stake, and if in fact it is as great an idea as we keep hearing that it is, it'll still be a great idea in 10 years.
My advice would be just to keep a tight rein on it and identify those areas that would be good for aquaculture and not good for aquaculture.
What Alaska needs to do is because of the fact that tastes have changed over the years and people want fresh fish, what Alaska should try to do is adapt itself to the market, as opposed to saying this is the way we've always done things and therefore this is the way we're always going to continue to do them. Because if they do that, they're going to miss the chance to grow with the consumer.
I have some sympathy with the Alaskan idea of watching what's going on in British Columbia before they jump right into the aquaculture business. I think a lot can be learned by what's going on in British Columbia now, and surely there's no rush to get involved in the aquaculture. In a few years it'll be clear here what the impacts are on markets and what the impacts are on the environment.
You need a very broad public process in place in advance that meets public concerns, and they are legitimate, no matter what the salmon farmers may say, about fish health, about genetic integrity, about market protection for your existing industry, which is not something that you should throw away, and all those concerns. And then when that's done, you may find that you're in a very good position to participate in the aquaculture industry.
we certainly don't say that we should prohibit all aquaculture. It's just that there are places where it's more appropriate than others.
If I were to make the decision for Alaska, I'd be inclined to go rather slowly and make sure we had good answers to these questions before we plunge into it.
There's going to be more and more of it around. It's not going to make any difference whether they do it in Alaska or not. I mean, there's a lot of it around, and there's a lot more coming.
I really think that we would be wise to prohibit finfish farming in this state until we get a feel for how this permit process works. Wait and see what happens with the markets. Wait and see what happens with the wild stocks that British Columbia has. Wait and see what happens with Norway's situation before we risk our own.
Wait and see our markets erode. Wait and see our opportunities disappear. But it doesn't mean that Alaska won't be able to participate in the future. That window of opportunity that I see is going to be closed is for the smaller person to be able to participate.
You know, no one should be stampeded by the promise of, take a good look at salmon farming before you jump, because you've got something very valuable and precious already, and there's no need to risk it. It'd be very foolish to, in fact, and I think that we have here in BC. I think our wild stock fishery is at risk because of the completely uncontrolled and negligent way that our government allowed salmon farming to develop.
I think I can speak fairly authoritatively on the environmental issue because I was a founding member of the Greenpeace organization. I was with Greenpeace for 15 years in policy development and in the last 6 years as one of the 5 international directors of Greenpeace. When I look at the planetary environmental situation and I look at the deforestation issue, when I look at the toxic chemical issue, at the nuclear issues, both in terms of the nuclear weapons issue and the nuclear waste issue from nuclear reactors, I can't get particularly excited about the environmental impact of aquaculture. As a matter of fact, you know, to put it in perspective, there's virtually no other industry that has less environmental impact than an aquaculture industry. But in the long run, I do not believe that we can have 5 billion people on this earth and not pay some attention from a husbandry and nurturing point of view to the marine system. We can't just keep extracting from it. We have to learn to understand the life cycles of the animals we're using for food. We have to learn to breed them.
Okay, I happen to believe they can coexist, but if the scale must tip, then it has to tip on the side of the environment. For the very simple reason that we have too many examples of where we didn't consider the environment and we're paying for it today. And in that regard, it just seems to me that since environment is an inheritance that we pass on, we ought to make sure we protect the environment.
Should salmon farming be allowed in Alaska? Listening to all of the arguments can be lengthy and confusing, but the decision is up to us.